Manhattan Project was a massive top-secret research project during World War II, and it had one specific aim: to figure out how to use the power of nuclear fission to create the world's first atomic bombs. If successful, they could unleash the most destructive force ever created by man, and all in the name of war. Scientists from all over the globe, including some of the very brightest minds of the time, were brought together to work on this groundbreaking project. The work mainly took place in Los Alamos, New Mexico. There, physicists, chemists, engineers, and military personnel worked day and night to find a way to create ultimate destruction. During the operations of the Los Alamos National Laboratory from 1943 to 1946, 24 lives were lost in various incidents. These range from construction accidents to bizarre incidents involving antifreeze-laced wine. Among the fruits of their labor were 2 bombs that would wipe out Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender and bringing an end to World War II. But the Manhattan Project didn't just produce those bombs. It also made other devices, including a plutonium core known as Rufus. Rufus was a heavy, radioactive sphere of plutonium. It was promised death and destruction from the moment it was molded. The core seemed to have a dark destiny written into its very existence. It was intended for use in another attack on Japan, but Rufus was spared when the war ended, but it was not forgotten. Rufus was also called the Demon Core, a nickname that it very much earned. The Demon Core had been promised a cataclysmic purpose, one that it seemed determined to fulfill. Haratune Krikor Daghlian Jr., otherwise known as Harry Daghlian, was born on May 4, 1921 in Waterbury, Connecticut. He was one of 3 children born to American parents, and he grew up with a sister named Helen and a brother named Edward. In 1938, at the age of 17, Harry began studying mathematics at MIT, but his interest soon shifted to a newly emerging field, particle physics. He then transferred to Purdue University in Indiana, graduated in 1942, and continued into graduate school. By 1944, his talents had caught the attention of the Manhattan Project, and he was then hired to work at the Los Alamos Laboratory on critical assembly with the famous scientist Otto Frisch. What Harry did not know at that moment was that just 1 year later, he would suffer a horrible accident that would change the entire history of nuclear science. On August 21st, 1945, as usual, Harry Daghlian was working on an experiment at the laboratory in Los Alamos. He was working on building a neutron reflector. But what exactly are we talking about here? Well, a neutron reflector is used in a criticality experiment. Its purpose is to reflect neutrons back into a fissile material, in this case, Rufus. In very simple words, Rufus was the heart of a bomb. When triggered, the core would undergo a process called nuclear fission. In this process, the nucleus of a plutonium atom is bombarded with neutrons, causing it to split into smaller nuclei and releasing a huge amount of energy. Energy in the form of heat, radiation, and explosive force. This chain reaction of nuclear fission releases a huge amount of energy in a fraction of a second. This results in a powerful explosion capable of causing widespread destruction, exactly what was seen in Japan. In this case, Daghlian had to very carefully stack 10-pound bricks of tungsten carbide around Rufus. The goal was to bring the core to the brink of supercriticality, the point at which a sustained nuclear chain reaction could be triggered. This was highly delicate, as pushing the core too far would result in an uncontrolled reaction. It would release lethal amounts of radiation. So basically, these experiments wanted to see exactly how far they could push the core, how far they could push their luck before it triggered a critical chain reaction. According to scientists, criticality experiments were just like tickling the tail of a sleeping dragon. as there was a constant risk of accidentally starting an uncontrolled nuclear reaction. And as you might guess, that is very, very bad. Enrico Fermi, the man who created the world's first nuclear reactor, had already warned the Los Alamos team about the dangers of these experiments. But despite all his warnings, the safety concerns were mostly swept under the rug for the sake of scientific progress. Progress in the name of horrendous destruction and misery. That night, after having dinner, Daghlian returned to the lab to finish some work, alone. This was a breach of safety protocol as there were no other scientists present, but there were 2 security guards. As Daghlian was about to place the final brick, neutron monitors alerted him that adding the last brick would push the core into a supercritical state. In simpler terms, the dragon was about to wake up. In an effort to prevent the disaster, Daghlian tried to pull the brick away, but in panic, he accidentally dropped the brick directly onto the core. This immediately triggered a chain reaction. The room was suddenly filled with a wave of heat and a crackle of blue light. Daghlian quickly tried to knock the brick away from the core, and he then disassembled the system by hand to stop the reaction, feeling his hands tingle as he did so. As he did this, he received a massive dose of neutron radiation. At this time, it was thought to be the biggest dose of radiation ever received by a human. It was at that exact moment that he knew he was about to die. The damage was already done. He was now a dead man walking. He rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. It started with sickness, but Daghlian eventually fell into a coma. Alongside Daghlian's hospital bed was friend and colleague Louis Slotin. He supported him through his final days, and he finally passed away on September the 15th, 1945, 25 agonizing days after the accident. He was just 24 years old. The security guards, having received a lower dose of radiation, survived. To the scientific community, Daghlian's death served as a wake-up call. Almost immediately, a committee was formed to update safety guidelines. More measures were built, such as requiring at least 2 people to conduct experiments together, and making sure that at least 2 neutron monitors with audio alerts were used at all times. But despite all the efforts to prevent such a disaster from happening again, the Demon Core was still hungry for more. Louis Alexander Slotin was a colleague of Daghlian, and the two were also friends. He was born on December 1st, 1910 to Jewish refugees who fled Russia and settled in a neighborhood of Eastern European immigrants in Winnipeg, Canada. Slotin was a gifted child. According to his brother Sam, he was able to study extremely long hours, and he also loved to do so. At times, he would even send his brother off to play games with friends, so that he could study in peace. Starting college at the University of Manitoba at just 16, Slotin outdid Daghlian, who was back then a 16-year-old college freshman. He got a university gold medal for physics and chemistry, and received his bachelor's degree in geology, followed by a master's degree in science. He soon earned a chemistry fellowship at King's College London. During this time, he took up amateur boxing and won a college championship, joking with his brother that all he got for his efforts was a black eye. In 1936, Slotin received his PhD in physical chemistry and became Dr. Slotin. After being rejected from a position with Canada's National Research Council, Slotin moved to the US to research nuclear chemistry at the University of Chicago. There, he built the first cyclotron in the Midwest. Despite his impressive achievements, Slotin's job did not pay well. He often had to rely on financial support from his father. This was not something he wanted to do. Eventually, Slotin's publications on radiobiology earned him an invitation to join the Manhattan Project, an exciting offer that he would later regret accepting. In 1944, he began his work at Los Alamos in New Mexico, focusing on bomb physics. It wasn't long before he found himself involved in criticality experiments, using both uranium and eventually plutonium. This brought him face to face with none other than Rufus, the Demon Core. Slotin quickly established himself as a risk-taker, often disregarding protocol. However, his contributions to the Manhattan Project were more than significant. He founded the core of Trinity, which was the first atomic device to be detonated. This earned him the title of Chief Armorer of the United States. After the end of World War II, Slotin began training a replacement for himself. He wanted to return to teaching and research at the University of Chicago. He felt uncomfortable with participating in projects that caused such destruction, as well as the death of his assistant and friend, Harry Daghlian. All of this together likely fueled his desire to leave Los Alamos. Even his boss, Enrico Fermi, had warned Slotin about his approach to critical assemblies. "You'll be dead within a year if you keep doing that," he said. Yet despite all these concerns and setbacks, Slotin stayed at Los Alamos. His trademark cowboy boots and blue jean shorts seemed to project a Wild West attitude into a situation that should have been anything but. On May the 21st, 1946, Slotin was demonstrating an experiment for 7 of his colleagues at Los Alamos. In the center of the room, on a table, sat the Demon Core. The plan was to trigger the first step of a fission reaction by placing a hemisphere of beryllium onto the 14-pound core. This beryllium dome, called a tamper, worked like the tungsten carbide bricks Daghlian had used. It reflected neutrons back into the core. But it was extremely crucial that the tamper never fully cover the core. This was to let some neutrons escape. Missing this step would be devastating. Slotin held the tamper with his left hand through a thumb hole at the top, and he kept the hemisphere apart using the tip of a flathead screwdriver in his right hand. This was obviously not official protocol. The nuclear cowboy was out in full force. Metal shims were supposed to be used to keep the gap, but they had been removed. And then, at exactly 3:20 p.m., the screwdriver slipped. The hemisphere fell, and in an instant a burst of radiation filled the room. Eyewitnesses reported that the room began to glow with blue ionization, and a wave of heat swept through the space similar to Daghlian's accident. A sour taste filled Slotin's mouth, and his left hand began to burn. Slotin, with his quick reflexes, shielded his colleagues with his body and attempted to stop the reaction. The total duration of the flash could not have been more than a few tenths of a second. Slotin reacted very quickly in flipping the tamper piece off, but it was already too late. Slotin, who had witnessed friend Harry Daghlian struggle with radiation poisoning, knew exactly the gravity of what had just happened. As the blue glow left the room, his first words were, "Well, that does it." His quick actions may have spared his colleagues from severe radiation exposure, but he himself received a lethal dose. It was Slotin that now held the title of the most radiated man in history. The security guard fled the room in terror as the room flashed and scientists began to yell. The lab was evacuated and the scientists gathered outside to wait for an ambulance to arrive. Slotin sketched out a diagram of where he and his colleagues were standing at the time of the accident. He also tried to use a radiation detector on several objects in the room with them. This included a Coca-Cola bottle and a brush. However, the detector itself was contaminated with radiation, so it could not be used. Los Alamos scientists used film dosimetry badges to measure exposure to radiation during an accident like this. But on that day, not a single person in the room was wearing their badge, breaking protocol yet again. In his confused and sick state, Slotin sent a colleague back into the contaminated lab to retrieve the badges from a locked lead box, but they were unusable. Slotin likely knew this, but as a later report highlighted, after such an exposure, people are in no condition for rational behavior. On the way to the hospital, he told a colleague, "You'll be okay, but I think I'm done for." Slotin began vomiting immediately after leaving the building, and he continued to do so on his first day in hospital. Upon arrival, he told a colleague, "I'm so sorry you got into this. I'm afraid I have less than a 50% chance of living. I hope you have better than that." On the second day, his condition seemed to improve, but this was short-lived. Slotin began to suffer a steep decline. The hand that had held the cord turned a waxy blue, blistered, and doctors kept it packed in ice. He suffered from severe intestinal distress, from reduced urine output, swollen hands, arrhythmia, blisters covering his arms, intestinal paralysis, and gangrene. A medical expert described the radiation throughout his body as a three-dimensional sunburn. Slotin had essentially cooked from the inside. But despite his suffering, Slotin insisted that doctors and scientists use his condition as a case study. He repeatedly discussed his test results with doctors and nurses. General Leslie Groves, the same man who had been with Oppenheimer at the detonation of the gadget, was sent to retrieve Slotin's parents from Winnipeg. They arrived on day 4. By day 5, his white blood cell count had dropped severely. By day 7, he was confused, his lips turned blue, and he was placed in an oxygen tent. Louis knew exactly what was happening. He then fell into a coma and took his last breath 9 days after the accident, on May 30th, 1946, at age 35. He was buried in Winnipeg in a sealed military casket. To study the effects of the radiation sickness, scientists requested an autopsy. Although it was against their religious traditions, Slotin's dad agreed, as one article reported him saying, Louis had been a scientist all his life, and that when it could do no harm, it would be wrong to prevent him adding to knowledge. Over 3,000 mourners attended his funeral, honouring a man who had pushed the boundaries of science, sometimes recklessly, and eventually paid the ultimate price. 4 of Slotin's colleagues were discharged by May 25th, and the others were described to be in satisfactory condition. Alvin Graves, the observer closest to Slotin during the accident and Slotin's trainee, stayed in the hospital for several weeks with acute radiation poisoning. Although he survived, he suffered from vision and neurological problems for the rest of his life. Despite surviving the immediate aftermath, 3 of the scientists later succumbed to radiation-related illnesses. Graves passed away 20 years later at age 55 from a heart attack. The security guard who had fled the room in terror could not escape a tragic fate. After being promoted to Sergeant First Class, he died in 1950 in North Korea. Radiation-related cancers plagued many of those who worked on the Manhattan Project. Daghlian's memory was honoured in May of 2000 in New London. His brother and sister made a memorial in his honour which read, "Though not in uniform, he died in service to his country."